Okay, great, Mary.
Okay, start with desolations and consolations. The desolation of cycles of hate. Since last we met, a truck was propelled into a synagogue in Michigan. The war in Iran, which may have provided some of the crude motivation for this obscene act of anti Semitism, has escalated and expanded, its purpose as opaque as the clouds of dust rising from ruined buildings. One of those ruins, a school filled with children. This war, in turn, is filling a widening forum for Islamophobia. Now, as Eid has concluded Ramadan, as Passover approaches, as we journey through Lent toward Easter, we pray for hearts to be reformed, such that they can hold faith and tolerance and carry us forward in hope towards peace. The desolation of loss, compounded by helplessness. We pray for our friend Sophia Gray, who recently lost her sister to cancer, and who, after opening her home to her Haitian compatriots, grieves with them as new restrictions preclude their ability to send life-sustaining remittances to families in their struggling homeland. We pray for Haiti's neighbor, Cuba, isolated from energy as it devolves. The desolation of disaster. We pray for the families of the pilots who lost their lives at LaGuardia Airport yesterday. The desolation of exclusion. We pray for our country as our government pursues new means of enacting exile. As the Supreme Court prepares to hear oral arguments on birthright citizenship next week, we lament the bigotry that seeks to banish this blessing and deny U.S.-born children of immigrants the privilege of American identity. As always, we pray for our migrant familia, that their constancy of purpose and vigilance will shield them from escalating risks, that our counsel and love will buffer their fears of legal peril, of loss of resources, and of separation from the safety and opportunity they seek in our democracy. Consolations. The consolation of new life. We are heartened, as always, by the surpassing gift of life. As we welcome newborn Yoselin to our ranks, we joyfully anticipate future additions to the Familia, as Apong and Julian Patrick prepare to welcome baby number 2 in June, and Michel-Ange and her partner, Benesse Simon, await a baby girl in the fall. We share their excitement as we offer our love. The consolation of milestones. Even as we give thanks for new beginnings, we celebrate conclusions and gratefully acknowledge that JP will finish his master's in social work at Catholic University this spring, and that Apong, who graduates from medical school in West Virginia on May 1st, will add to her many roles the title of doctor. The consolation of opportunity. We're thankful for the sustaining hope of good jobs for our familia, for Cindy, who will interview tomorrow at Marriott, and for Peterson, whose resume, polished to a buff by John and Don and Anne Marie, is now ready for a primetime launch. The consolations of partnership and solidarity. Earlier this month, Manuel, a dear friend of a parishioner, was detained by ICE after a stop by Park Police and moved from Virginia to points unknown at the border. With advice from Amica and timely intervention, Manuel was found. Forewarned, he refused to sign an agreement to be deported and has been released and reunited with his family with a path to legal permanence. Tomorrow, Catholics across the DMV will gather in prayer at ICE headquarters on a day that marks the 46th anniversary of the martyrdom of Oscar Romero, whose words resound in the advocacy this moment demands. We are encouraged by the breadth of solidarity across geography and institutions and faiths. Tonight, as we welcome Mario Russell, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, we are grateful for his insight and for a forum in which dialogue can thrive. Mr. Russell is an attorney and professor with over 25 years of experience in migration policy and law. He's lectured and presented extensively and has served on state and federal immigration policy and practice committees. Before joining CMS, Mr. Russell was director of the Immigrant and Refugee Services Division of Catholic Charities in New York, where he oversaw legal resettlement, asylum, unaccompanied minors, and day labor services. He conducted litigation in federal, district, and appeals courts and managed the Asylum Defense Clinic at St. John's University School of Law, where he teaches immigration and comparative refugee law, both in the US and in Europe. Mr. Russell previously worked as regional director for Clinic and consulted with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees on asylum protection in Eastern Europe. Welcome, Mario Russell.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Ashley. Would you like me to start now? Is it my turn? Yes. Okay, just want to make sure because you had a beautiful reflection and prayer, so I didn't know that we sort of moved from one to the other. So thank you, very nice, and it's nice to be joining this family for this, I guess, after dinner or dinner encounter. I don't know who the tech expert is. And Ashley, if that's you, can I share my screen with the group?
Yep, give me 1 second.
Sure. And while Ashley figures that out, again, let me just say thank you for inviting me and for this opportunity to get to know you and to talk a little bit about a difficult subject and in a time that is difficult, tumultuous, and painful. I will simply with you, that I started in this field, and can you see this?
Yes. Yeah, we got your screen.
And do you see it in kind of like presentation format or?
No, it's
we
the
just
actual
see,
app.
yeah, we don't see it as presentation.
I'm sorry.
Do not see it as presentation, right? Which means I need to do it as a slideshow, I guess.
Yep.
So I'll do my best to.
Control F9, if I remember. No, it's Control plus something that it gets to you.
So what do you see, if I can ask?
We just see your screen, so we don't see the presentation link as a presentation yet.
You can choose the very first thing that says
from beginning. Yeah.
Yep.
Go.
On the left.
Is that better?
Yes. Now.
Yeah. Got it.
Okay. Great. I started in this work back in 1988 or so, 89. And after having studied philosophy and music in college and wanting to be active in the world, and did some work with the Peace Corps, and then joined a group called the Vincentian Service Corps, which is sort of like the less cool version of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And maybe the Vincentians wanted to be like the Jesuits, right? But who can? And so for a year I lived with in a community of young college graduates like myself, working with the poor in New Jersey, and worked at a Catholic Charities with immigrants. Completely sort of happenstance placement. And had the opportunity to work with about 300 or 400 individuals and families over that time who were getting legalized under the then Amnesty Act. And raise your hand if you remember hearing about that, right? From 1986, signed into, passed as legislation by both houses of Congress and signed into law by none other than Ronald Reagan. And so I had the chance to sort of see, not knowing one important thing, see the power of law, the transformative power of law. And in that sense, sort of the philosophy meets action meets social change in the best sense, um, literally with a stroke of a pen in an afternoon after presenting applications, maybe a dozen men and women lives were changed from, quote, illegal to, quote, legal. And it was really extraordinary. Little did I know that that was probably the best piece of legislation that I would see in my lifetime for, again, another 35 or so years, and getting us to where we are today, which I suppose historically um, tells us a little bit about the movement of the collective psyche. Anyway, the point simply is, in part, is that we're invited, as much as to be in the good moments, we are invited here and now to be in the most difficult and traumatic ones. And I appreciate your commitment to be a family and to help the families in need, and being in accompaniment and solidarity with them, which is an extraordinary act and a deeply profound and necessary one as we travel through this time. I now work at the Center for Migration Studies, which is a Catholic think tank on migration. We do reports, studies, analyses, briefings. We publish two journals, the Journal of International Migration Review and the Journal of Migration and Human Security. We provide, kind of that remote now education, like webinars and podcasts. We do in-person academic and policy symposiums. And then very importantly, we convene several times a year, sort of the Catholic family that works on migration, whether it is Catholic Legal Immigration Network, whether it's Catholic Charities USA or the 162 Catholic Charities affiliates, Catholic Relief Services, the congregations, the Jesuit Migration Network, right? You name it. Hundreds of groups and thousands of people of goodwill. And we convene once or twice a year at a university to kind of think, look, judge, and see what the next levels of action are as a community, right, within the context of Catholic social teaching, which is, and I'll say this to a crowd that I trust agrees with me, absolutely gloriously profound and brilliant, and always revelatory and revolutionary. And I think as Pope Francis, I think invites whatever the act of charity that informs Catholic social teaching. The vision ultimately is a transformation of the self, in fact, right? So even when he talked about the four verbs that go to the welcoming of the stranger, actually welcome, right? Protect and defend, promote and integrate. His vision of the verb of integration was one by which we, as a receiving community, are integrated psychically and spiritually and rendered whole by, right, the inclusion of the migrant into our family. So profound psychological and spiritual ideas, which we need to keep believing in and moving forward. And I think Pope Leo invites hope in the best sense to keep that vision alive. So that's maybe all by way of background to sort of set up a little bit what my comments will be, and I'll try to move a little quickly through them and give time for conversation. I think we want to go maybe till, I guess, 7:40 or so. Ashley, tell me if I'm wrong, and move me along, and I'll do my best. The danger of telling a lawyer to speak is that the lawyer will then speak, and then you run out of time. So I'll do this. And again, right, just in the context of migration and human rights, obviously we're always focused on the vision of the individual in balanced relationship with the sovereign, and the importance of the right to migrate, the human rights that underlie the idea and the reality of dignity and which is an ineffable concept. It doesn't lend itself to definition. It's sort of a tautological concept, which you probably know well. But balancing them against the sovereign's right to control borders, all right? The common good is produced in that dynamic, in that dialectic, but there isn't a vision within Catholicism or Catholic social teaching that tells we should have open borders. The common good is also one that a community needs to foster, receive, and promote, and so protect, in the sense that if the common good is in fact derogated, let's say by too much immigration, right? In theory, Catholic social teaching would say it's important to regulate and manage that flow. That said, we've experienced, I think, a kind of a collective trauma in that sense in the last year. And my task is, I think, is to tell you a little bit about what we've seen in 2025. And I will say that what we've seen in 2025 mostly sets the stage for what we will continue to see, obviously, in 26, 27, and 28. The midterms are coming in November of this year. That's important, probably for democracy and for constitutional order, potentially. But I'll say this, at the broadest level, it may not change how we see immigration being managed, handled, abused, because most of that has been done through executive orders and executive power. That is to say, presidential orders and presidential power. And an interesting thing about power is the power might not be one that the Constitution had contemplated this president could use. Certainly George Washington may have something to say about, right, the use and the effectuation of the levels of power that this president has. But the problem is that the correction of power only exists to some extent in two places: the courts, or I should say three: the courts, the legislature, and the people, right, who vote. The legislature has all but essentially deferred and abandoned its role. The courts, hard to say. We'll see. Depends. On a good day in the district courts, we see some work towards protecting migrants, but the Supreme Court is an entirely different subject and can of worms, as they say. But either way, the problem with the courts is it takes them a long time, right, to kind of serve as that protective guardrail. So really what we are focusing on is voting. But again, will the midterms affect change? Probably not, because again, the president will continue to do what he's doing. And what we've seen again in this time over the course of 2025 is really that the change has been reworked, right, through administrative action, not through law, through policy, or even regulation. Regulations are illegal, sort of first step into the implementation of law. And that's been done through a shift in narrative to a degree, I think, that we can all agree we've never seen before, right? Creating proxies and justifications under national security, crime and drugs, invasion as metaphor, right? In a sense, the use of narrative, the use of emergency, the use of potentially the Alien Enemies Act, USCIS changing its slogan to make America safe again, when in fact it's really the welcoming arm in theory, right? So there's a kind of a defensive crouch, defensive posture. Notably, and I think this is important to pay attention to, it is a very coordinated and powerful weaponizing of the whole of government. These aren't separate agencies kind of following their own tracks and their own initiatives and their own secretaries. They're very coordinated, whether it's ICE, USCIS, CBP, FBI, right, DHS, even even Health and Human Services, right? All the arms of government are, in a sense, activated and weaponized in this campaign to do what? Two things: exclude migrants and expel. So let's keep that in mind, right? There are a couple of kind of pairings that we want to pay attention to tonight. Illegal versus legal, and then exclusion versus expulsion. as I mentioned, another feature of where we are and what we've seen and where we're going is that even while we see challenges to these practices, to these, 500 plus administrative actions, the administration, the president has figured out and that he can continue those practices even when they're on appeal. So that will continue to happen. We will continue to see, maybe a little bit less clamorously, but we'll continue to see the militarization of enforcement, the masked men and women, right? The weaponization, quite literally and figuratively, in order to fundamentally change the existential dynamics for migrants in America, which is to say, it is a time of fear, right? A time of retrenchment, a time of entering into the shadows, a time of giving up, and a time where every encounter with migration, or even now potentially state or municipal authorities and police, the park police, right, becomes a supercharged encounter with a potential for threat. And as a result, it creates and casts a wide net, right? A wide net that goes to fear into the lives of even those who are not the worst of the worst. And that's the thesis really that has governed Trump's agenda is I'm going after the worst of the worst. Well, he's not, because there are no worst of the worst left. I'm going to share these slides with you, but I'm not going to go through them here, other than just a kind of note that the two of the three, and I'm only going to focus on two main buckets of change, are in the humanitarian realm and in the enforcement realm. In the humanitarian realm, we see a lot of restrictions developed in 2025 and then again continuing into 2026, all around things such as asylum, right? Those with cases that are pending, those that were granted that are now under review, all immigration applications suspended. Well, that's humanitarian because it's the reunification of families, right? Applications for asylum or other summarily rejected because of ridiculous clerical mistakes, such as you wrote not applicable in answer to a question, not rejected, effectively denied. The shutdown of the border, so no ability for folks to seek and ask for asylum, what's called territorial asylum, when they reach the United States, right? They put their foot in the United States and say, I want protection. Well, international law historically has said, yes, you can make a claim and a request for asylum. Travel bans, the termination of humanitarian parole. Think about the Venezuelans, think about the Ukrainians, think about the Afghans, CHNV, right? All of those have been populations protected by, under the Biden administration, humanitarian parole. TPS, I know it's an area of concern for you. Yes, of course, also kind of seeing a slow but potentially real devolution. On the enforcement side, kind of already alluded to this, but the focus will continue on what are so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. We in New York are, of course, thinking and preparing around this. It's just a matter of time. We've talked about the militarization of law enforcement with a powerful sort of constitutional workaround, if you will. Notably, right, the continuing kind of fearless, arrogant, and uncontrolled willingness and acceptance to profile, whether it's color, accent, or presence in the workplace. Again, as I said, the creation of supercharged confrontation. And this leads to now the claim by immigration or the administration that it has deported, some 622, probably a little bit more people. We just don't know. We were just studying a little bit on the detention and deportation. But what we do know is that there is an increase in detention. Absolutely. The number now is around 70, 71,000. Historically, it's been around 24 to 22, up to 30. And with now, notably, a number of deaths that are happening in detention. This is all sort of informed by four, I think, features that I think about, worth sort of mentioning, but again, not studying at length. But really, this comes out of a vision, um, I think probably shared by the president, but really activated by Stephen Miller. The notion that America's identity um, as a civilized country is under threat, right? If those are his words, if you import the third world, you become the third world. Those are his words. And the notion that really this ultimately is a question of color, culture, custom. And harkening back to a vision 102 years ago, when similarly, interestingly, this country, experienced another kind of moral spasm and a cultural spasm in reaction to Italian, Irish, German, Polish, right? Sort of Southern Mediterranean immigration and the fear that it experienced, and that it was getting awash in a kind of changed culture. And if you read the headlines from those days, 1922, 1923, they're very similar to kind of what the rhetoric is now coming out of the administration. And so what's interesting is in 1924, a very restrictive act was passed, which did one among many other important things. But the one that I think is really key is that it created the concept of legal versus illegal. And it's important to note, I think, just to put in your back pocket, because, it's a little bit like when Nixon said, I'm not going to call Americans voters, I'm going to call them taxpayers. And the language creates a whole different perceptual content for how you understand human beings. So the 1924 Act created legality and illegality. And that's important because legality and illegality now have become, in my opinion, the fig leaf, the proxy to make the case for what is essentially a cultural, ethnic, and racial animus. Because you can bypass all those concerns, not say that you're affecting racist policies, but you're just enforcing the rule of law. These are illegal people. And that allows, right, the enforcement and the equation to go forward. But I think it's a flag, right? And it's an existential flag. And I'll say something a little bit later about that. That creates, I think, tension and contradiction in ourselves that needs to be resolved. And that, I think, is the way forward. Politically, another feature of where we are today is that there's no bipartisan, right, consensus anymore. And there's a deliberate breaking with post-war humanitarian visions of international law and international order and international cooperation. Miller is moving forward on the principle of numbers, not lives and people. And that's really key, right? So it doesn't affect his analysis of whether there's racial profiling or improper arrests in homes or in the workplace. We need 3,000 people to be arrested each day because that'll create 1 million per year of arrests and I guess theoretically deportations and detentions and deportations. And then finally, all of it is sort of supported by what I would say, unfortunately, right, are lies about illegals, which is really the top line catch-all concept. Underneath those is a notion of, oh, they're all criminals or they're consuming social welfare, right? They're breaking with our important sort of dangerous cultural traditions such as eating pets, like crazy stuff, right? But once even those are sort of disputed as false and not supported by the facts, there's still the ability to call people illegal. And this notion of invasion by illegals, right? Already you begin to see that the facts don't support it. Truth is, and the graph there goes to about 2024, we've always essentially had about 13 to 14 to 15%, more or less, since going back to the 1850s, at least about 10% of the American population, total population, made of foreign born. No different today than that was 100, 150 years ago. So this idea of invasion by immigrants and by aliens and by illegals is just completely, right, not supported by the facts. We're still at that same more or less number. The challenges are, and this merits a lot more of a deeper dive, but the challenges are that our immigration system, unlike the one before 1924, as it was then modified in 1965, doesn't really permit for meaningful and fulsome and expeditious immigration to America. And there are only three ways to do it, essentially. One is that sort of purple and blue section, which is family, right? So that's close to 58% of immigration happens through family. About 27 in that green wedge happens through employment and labor. And then the other wedge is basically sort of other, which I would kind of classify generally as protection, right? Asylum, refugees, and humanitarian parole, which leads to other kind of methodologies. Fine, right? Three areas, family, work, and protection. But they're cumbersome, slow, lots of exclusions. So even if you apply for asylum, it can take you 3, 5, 7, 8 years to get a decision, much less a grant. So in some senses, right, the thing to ask yourself is what happens during that time that people are in the United States seeking this benefit. Of course, they marry, they have children, they buy a car, they maybe buy a house, they have a job, they build a community, right? They become rooted in the American life, in the community, citizens with a lowercase c. And there's a really profound question as to what should we do with those people who, as a result of an ineffectual system, and I wouldn't say that it's broken. I know colleagues say it's broken. It's just under-resourced. It's old. The laws are old, right? But it's really under-resourced and not up to date to serve the needs of the day. But again, right, if we sort of look at then the question of, well, there are so many, you know, people here in the United States that need to be deported, who've overstayed, who've, been pending with their cases in front of the courts, and we'll look at those numbers in a minute. But the facts don't support that they are sort of the worst of the worst. And the moment you scrub away the facts that you can see on this slide, then again, the administration is left either to ignore the facts, which is really something they can do quite well, or going to slip into the illegal versus legal category. So even though they can say the 70% of the people in ICE detention have no criminal conviction, right? And less than 14 of those who do don't have any violent crimes. Well, it doesn't matter because they're still illegal. And there's a question of a rule of law issue, like, right, obeying and respecting the law. My ancestors did it this way. Well, your ancestors did it this way in 1922 or 1893 because there were no immigration laws. You got off a boat, you got a job, and you had citizenship within 6 months. A different era. And we don't have a system that can keep up with both the American needs for integration and labor, and of course, family unity, labor force, and protection. I want to note a couple of things that are, I think, interesting. When we talk about the undocumented, and I know you guys are all fluent and expert, so I'm going to say something that you know is BS. Oh, excuse me, that you know is false. You've said, oh, there are 30 million illegals, there's 40 million undocumented, but false. That number at best is about 14.5 million. And we're talking about the undocumented. But here's what's really important. Of those, 5.6, and you kind of pump up that number a bit, close to 5.75 million, are people that you know well and you serve well. People with temporary protected status, DACA, those adjusting to non-immigrant status through the U and the T visas, right? Victims of crime and trafficking, special immigrant juveniles, and notice the last two yellow highlights, asylum seekers and those with humanitarian parole. Almost 4.8, 4.9 million people. So 14.5 million undocumented, of which close to 5.6, 5.7. So I'm going to say a third, if not close to 40%. Actually documented, right? They have a kind of liminal temporary status. They're not seeking to evade the authorities. They presented themselves and are actually very well known to the authorities, right? They go to court. They go to immigration to get their TPS renewed or their work permit renewed. So these are people who've been here for 3, 5, 10 years sometimes, and are not in that sense sort of free floating in the United States as some kind of um, to use the language and the metaphors that we see, disease or poison or corruption or invasion. Interestingly, right, and just sort of look at the highlights of when we talk about the undocumented. And again, it's a mixture of, right, people without legal status as a whole, asylum seekers, parole. You can see the chart. You can share this with your friends. But look at what the average number of years in the US is for some of these folks. 15 years if you've been without legal status. DACA recipients, 24 years. There's a real question there as to what's just and what should be done. So when we talk about exclusion, okay, he's closed the border, no more refugees, only 6 or 7 Afrikaners can come in, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? So close the door. But the question about expulsion requires a different moral consciousness because you do have people here who've been here for a lifetime, a generation. And the question as to what should be done should yield a very different answer than saying close the border and don't let anybody new in, which of course in and of itself problematic. I'm going to move through these slides so I can kind of get to a couple of concluding thoughts. But I obviously invite you to understand and to appreciate that the question of rule of law kind of rubs up against, in today's context, the question of what is right. Right? What is right for people who've been here a long time? The rule of law question, which is a bit black and white, isn't the right tool necessarily for answering the question of, does someone have a moral claim to membership over time? Some of our great philosophers, Hobbes said so, right? Some of our contemporary philosophers, like Joseph Cairns, tells us growing up in a society makes you a member of that society. And I think here the Catholic imagination invites that kind of an idea. And I don't think we can give it up and to be rebuked by those who talk about legal, illegal, rule of law, but they came illegally, they overstayed. That's just half the answer. But the other answer lies in something more profound, particularly for those, again, who've been here for a long time. I think the bishops have obviously said and spoken and addressed these issues in a relatively muted way over the years, but more recently kind of showed up a little bit better. We've been working on a project called Impact Immigration Prophetic Action Project to help the bishops put out more statements, such as that second one by the border bishops, and to bring forward more dynamism and a catalyzing of the Catholic voice, because I think the Catholic voice is able to see through some of these proxy ideas, right, of legality, illegality, and rule of law. I want to close with this that I think was very interesting when I came across it. A Fox News poll of 1,000 or so voters back in 2024. And I think their answers sort of posit both the challenge and the solution, in a sense, for how we go forward. But I think it's a psycho-spiritual one that holds contradiction, or better yet, holds paradox. So these people were asked 6 questions, and they want to focus on the second one. Should immigrants who are here illegally be deported? And you'll notice that 67% said yes. It's a lot, 2/3. And then they were asked another question, that fourth question. Should immigrants who are employed, but here illegally, right, without legal status, should they be allowed to apply for that status? Which is to say, should there be a way forward to make them legal? That number, 62%. And if you'll permit, can we round that up to 2/3 also? So that we can say 2/3 answered the first question, deport them all. And then 2/3 answered the fourth question, well, but if they work, there should be a way forward for them. Second question, I think, is about rule of law, which tickles, particularly, I think, the Protestant imagination, right? About black and white, about right and wrong, about you're in, you're out, you should abide by the rules. But the fourth, I think, also kind of triggers another level of conscience. Perhaps it's compassion, perhaps it's mercy, perhaps it's reasonability. Well, if they're working, then they're contributing and they should be able to stay, which is really interesting to me. Um, and I think we all hold probably at some level both of those ourselves as a society, perhaps as individuals too, on a good day or a bad day. But I think as a society, we hold both at the same time. And where we have, I think, a crisis right now is of imagination, of a moral imagination, of a psychic imagination, of a social imagination that can hold two things that are arguably equally true at the same time and not fall into the temptation of one or the other. Because then we fall down. And we ourselves, I think, perhaps even in this room, maybe don't do a good job of talking about, hey, if someone loses their asylum claim, should they go home? Right? So we maybe have been not so strong on the rule of law piece, but I think a solution needs to hold both better. And I suspect that most Americans can and do have the ability to hold both. We just have to figure out how to get out of this fever, right? And break it and move into something that is more integrated and more enlightened. That's what we're trying to begin to do. I think a lot of this has to do with narrative and changing the narrative, what you're doing, which is to protect, help, support, engage, encounter people, and bring their stories forward. So a project that we're working on, that is to say the Center for Migration Studies with Hope Border Institute, is to help bishops and communities in different cities across the United States. We just started this in December, to activate responses, vigils, op-eds, visitations, supports in other ways, such as accompaniment or family support. We've done a convening of 100 or so people with 5 dioceses and the bishops in Providence. 2 weeks ago, we were in Phoenix with 8 dioceses and 1 archdiocese and 3 bishops there. We're engaging in Philadelphia, in New York, Detroit in May, all with a view to saying, hey, what do people on the ground want to do in the Catholic structure, parishes, charities, missions, congregations, but importantly, who need their bishop's support. So what we do is sort of make sure that the bishop has signed on with a vision and view that the people in the pews and the pastors have the permission and the green light to go forward and do a response that's public in one way or another, and also real, of course. In the end, hopefully, to change a little bit of how people will vote, and we hope that will make a difference. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening to me. Sorry, Ashley, if I went along too long, and I just noticed here it's a quarter
No,
late.
thank you.
But I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? There we go. Great. All right. So I think, if people have questions, if you want to just raise your hand hold on, I'm going to pause the recording.